As we continue our episodes looking at the musical output of Paul McCartney through the decades, we've looked at all the great music that he did in the 60s with the Beatles. Then we looked at the first part of the 70s, where he continued a little bit of work with the Beatles, and then he went off on a solo career, and then he formed Wings. We'll pick up with the second part of the 1970s to see what kind of great music Paul's going to put out in these 5 years. You ready? Let's drop the needle. As I said, Paul has kind of moved on from the Beatles by this point, but Capitol is sitting on all of these Beatle recordings, and by gosh, they're going to try to figure out ways to repackage them and sell them to us yet again. And I remember when they started doing this, I was going, how many different ways can they possibly do this, and why would people buy this? Well, they did it a lot of different ways, and yeah, I bought them. So Capitol decides to release a double album called Rock and Roll Music, where they went back into the Beatles catalog and culled songs that were more rock and roll to put on this double album. Now, most Beatles fans already had copies of all of these songs, but quite a few of them, including myself, bought this album. It did really well, apparently spurred on by Beatle interest fueled by the Wings tour, where Paul actually included Beatles songs. It reaches number 2 in the US and 11 in the UK. In April of 1977, Paul releases an album under the pseudonym Percy Thrills Thrillington, and the album is called Thrillington. And what it is, it's instrumental covers of all the songs that were on Ram. Now, Paul does not appear on the album, but he is the producer. In April of 1977, a German record label releases a double live album called The Beatles at the Star Club, Hamburg, Germany, 1962. And it is a live recording of those early days of the Beatles in Germany. Now, the audio quality is not good. It was recorded with one microphone on a home recorder. But nonetheless, Beatles fans worldwide snapped up this for its historical significance. Ringo is playing drums, having just replaced Pete Best. And of all the songs on the record, there are only 2 that are Lennon-McCartney songs, and that's I Saw Her Standing There and Tell Me Why. Now, the release of that German record scared Capitol because they saw how well it was selling. And when the Beatles played the Hollywood Bowl in August of 64 and 65, those concerts were recorded with the idea of putting out a live album. But the screaming was so loud that the tapes were shelved. They figured they can never get an album out of this. But when that German release came out and Capitol saw how much money could be made, yeah, they decided to put out the Beatles live at the Hollywood Bowl. They went to George Martin and said, here are these tapes, clean them up the best you can. Although these recordings were 12 to 13 years old when they came out, the album still did really well. It went to number 1 in the UK and number 2 in the US. Now it's 1978, and Wings is really just a trio with Paul, Linda, and Denny Laine, and they record an album called London Town. Tracks include London Town, I'm Carrying, Children, Children, I've Had Enough, and With a Little Luck. Critics did not like this record, but it hit number 4 in the UK and 2 in the US. Later in 1978, Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley join Wings, and they release an album called Back to the Egg. But the album doesn't really contain any real hits. I like Getting Closer, Old Siam Sir, Arrow Through Me, and the great Rockestra theme. After the album, the group decides to go on tour to support it. But when they arrive in Japan, McCartney is arrested for carrying marijuana, and he goes to jail. So, Wings dissolves. Paul was released after 9 days in jail and deported from Japan back to England. In November 1979, Paul decides to release a Wings Greatest Hits album. 4 tracks make their album debut, as previously they were only singles. They are Another Day, Junior's Farm, Hi Hi Hi, and Mull of Kintyre. Also, the song Live and Let Die appears for the first time on a McCartney album, as previously it had only been on the film soundtrack. The record reaches 5 in the UK and 29 in the US. And then, just in time for Christmas of 1979, in England, Apple releases a Beatles album called Rarities. It contains a number of singles that were never on albums, and the only 2 Beatles songs that were ever sung in another language. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So when you look at the decade of the 1970s, Paul has released 18 albums, some as a solo artist, some with Wings, some Beatle compilations. It's a heck of a lot of music. And I believe our boy is really on a roll, or as he would later say, let me roll it. Okay, Paul, we will. In the next episode, we'll be looking at your output in the 1980s. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.